Hi, this is Larry Blumenfeld. I'm here in my place in Brooklyn, New York.
And I'm Dr. Michael White. I'm in New Orleans at home.
Now, of course, the two of us should be in Charleston, South Carolina, beginning the Wells Fargo Jazz Series of Spoleto Festival USA. And there, we had planned to celebrate the legacy of Danny Barker, the tribute band you put together. Anyone I've talked to in New Orleans, from Elder Masters to Wynton Marsalis to Terrence Blanchard to Trombone Shorty, have talked to me about Danny Barker and pointed me in his direction. Why is that?
Well, Danny Barker is one of the most important musicians in the history of New Orleans music, both inside New Orleans and outside. So he had a very long career and a tremendous legacy. He made many contributions to jazz and to New Orleans culture.
Yeah, now, of course, he left. He's one of the musicians who left early on and made a real name for himself in New York City, but then returned. So in New York City, the list of people he played with is astounding, isn't it?
Yeah, I would say that throughout his career, in fact, Danny Barker probably played with the widest range of musicians in terms of styles, different styles in the entire history of jazz, ranging from, early New Orleans jazz musicians into modern musicians, modern style musicians. He played
Calloway, Louis Armstrong, Charlie Parker. Who else should we name here?
Oh, yeah. Well, in the early jazz idiom, he played with stride pianist James P. Johnson. Mm-hmm. In the New Orleans style, he played with Jelly Roll Morton, Louis Armstrong, Sidney Bechet, Bunk Johnson, his uncle Paul Barberin. He also played with Henry Red Allen, many other people in swing, as you mentioned, Cab Calloway, Lucky Millender, Billie Holiday, Lester Young, Coleman Hawkins, Ben Webster.
Maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves here. Of course, Danny Barker played banjo and guitar, but at a moment in time when those were key instruments in jazz tradition, right?
Yeah, Danny Barker was very special because he had a great sense of rhythm and timing that was crucial in both New Orleans jazz and also swing music, because those were, dance forms. And so rhythm and timing had to be really good to be successful.
Later on, Danny Barker returned to New Orleans, and I guess there was a moment in time when he helped rekindle a traditional jazz that maybe had fallen out of favor. And also, I guess that was about the same time that that spark was being lit within you. Yeah. How did you first encounter Danny and his legacy?
Well, I had started out becoming interested in traditional New Orleans jazz after high school. And I spent a lot of time just really trying to find out what it was. But I had certainly heard of Danny Barker, and the first time I saw him was at the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival, performing with his band and his wife, Blue Lou Barker. But the first time I actually met him was one day when he came to start teaching a class, Afro-American music at Xavier University. And
which is where you teach now and where you have an endowed chair, right?
Which is where I teach now, where I have an endowed chair, and that same class I've been teaching for the last 35 years.
Okay. So when Danny was teaching there.
So when he taught there, the first day he came, it's a very strange thing that happened. I was in the library reading a book, and it had a picture of Danny and Blue Lou, and I looked at the picture, and all of a sudden something felt strange, and I looked up, and in the doorway I thought I saw him standing there with an instrument case and a bag, and typical Danny, brown pants, a red and white check coat, a derby, and I said, no, I can't look in a book and then the person I'm looking at appears before my eyes. So I closed my eyes, shook my head, opened them again, and no one was there. And so for a while I sat there questioning my sanity, but then I said, no, that must have been him. So I walked around the library, I searched for 15, 20 minutes everywhere, asked people, no Danny Barker, no person. So finally one person said, well, they're starting to use, on the top floor, they're starting to use one of the rooms as a classroom. Maybe somebody's up there. So I went up there, and sure enough, there he was. And that was his first day teaching Afro-American music at Xavier University. And I sat in on that class every time. We would talk before and after class and became friends. And although I had been playing for about a year with Doc Paulin's brass band, he said, why don't you could come along with the kids and be in the Fairview too. So I joined the Fairview brass band, and I was in the second generation of that group.
So now, yeah, you're talking about the Fairview Baptist Church band. And why was that so important? What was so important about that band?
Well, the Fairview Baptist Church band is important because it introduced a lot of youngsters to traditional jazz music, and also the idea of a musical life, the possibility of becoming a musician as an outlet for a career and a lifestyle. So a lot of people in the first generation of Fairview became professional musicians and are well known first in brass band circles, but then even beyond that in playing jazz in other forms and contexts.
Now you talked a little bit before about Danny's appearance. So he was very much a flamboyant, gregarious, maybe even raconteur type. Yeah, can you give us a little more of an idea of what it was like to be in Danny Barker's presence, and what he looked like, drove around in?
Well, first of all, Danny Barker was a very complex man. He had a lot of different sides to him, but he liked to be entertaining. So he had a sense of humor and a certain wit about him that was really great. I was very fortunate to not only know him and play with him probably several hundred times, but also I had the opportunity to see him in other contexts. Of course, I would visit him at home, but I also saw him as a member of boards and commissions and committees. I'll tell you one story that gives you an idea of how humorous he could be at a certain point, but how at the same time he could be feisty and protest. I was in a board meeting where some unnamed board member, so-called jazz historian, had the audacity to say that Duke Ellington never composed a song in his life, that he stole everything. And there was dead silence in the room. And all of a sudden, all you could hear was this loud snore. And I looked over, and Danny Barker was like, and he wasn't sleeping, he wasn't snoring, but that was his response. And everybody understood that that was his way of saying that was total bull. And so that gives you one idea, it's one story. But he was very humorous. He was very much into history. He was very much concerned about society. He loved New Orleans culture and New Orleans music. He talked quite a lot about the accomplishments of great New Orleans musicians. Probably the one he talked about the most was Sidney Bechet, because he said Bechet was like the first New Orleans musician to leave home and make it big, and people found out about his records and his travels and exploits, and that was a big thing for people back in New Orleans. But he was a living history book. I mean, he could tell you so many stories about all of the things going in New York and Harlem, during the part of the Renaissance period, not only with music and musicians, but also with writers and artists and sports legends and,
But now, as a musician, what do you think you most learned or gained from experience with Danny Barker? What did he teach you musically?
Well, musically, he used to always tell the younger musicians to always learn how to play the melody. Said, if you don't understand the chords or how to improvise on a song, always learn how to play the melody as pretty as you can, because the melody is always correct. But I think the thing that I actually learned the most from sitting beside him was the importance of timing and rhythm. I mean, you can practice all you want and learn all you want, but when the rhythm swings a certain kind of way, it's like magic happens. I remember one time I played a job with him in New Jersey, and he played rhythm so incredibly great that I had a feature solo number, and it was like I couldn't stop playing. It was like the rhythm hit. It just captured me and just, just allowed all kinds of things to flow out. So that timing and rhythm was so great and important. And I learned that from him. One of my favorite Sidney Bechet records is one in which he's playing. And you can tell that Bechet is very inspired by the rhythm that Danny is putting out. So that's...
What recording is that?
Well, it's under various names, but the particular recording is called The Genius of Sidney Bechet.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And that is my favorite recording of Summertime on it, and a few other standard songs. And I mean, Bechet's playing is incredible, and it's because of that extra push and lift that Danny Barker provides with that rhythm guitar.
Now, I know you've honored Danny many times, including recently at Jazz at Lincoln Center. And of course, what we were going to do in Charleston was in honor of Danny. How do you translate that legacy to this moment? I mean, there's a repertoire, but what else do you do to bring it to life?
Well, Danny Barker inspired me in many ways. One of those is in terms of being creative, and in terms of advising younger musicians. I mean, I always emphasize the things that he emphasized about who to listen to on different instruments, which bands and recordings to listen to, things like that. But also, partly because of him, I've been writing new songs, and sometimes I hear that rhythm in my mind when I'm making up these songs. So he's inspired me in a lot of different ways. And of course, I always think about him when I'm teaching this class, because my first real encounter with that class was through him. And I think about a lot of the stories he used to talk about, a lot of the stories and adventures that we actually had, things like that. And those remain very inspirational. Some of the sayings he had, musicians still kind of, talk to each other in that way or joke about.
Now, the reason we're not in Charleston now, the reason why I'm in my place and you're holed up in your home is, of course, this COVID-19 coronavirus crisis. When I first began talking to you about music and New Orleans culture and the many things we've discussed, it was in the context of a very different crisis, the floods that followed the levee failures after Hurricane Katrina. In some ways, this must call up some of those ghosts, but also it's very different, right?
Right. I was talking to someone the other day, and this is the second time that we've gone through something that, people say, well, life will never be the same after this. So we thought that Hurricane Katrina was the, defining event in the history of New Orleans and the history of our lives. And then now we have to deal with this, something that has a much larger, global significance and uncertainty. So in a way it's similar, but in a way it has a life all its own, trying to survive in the age of, the coronavirus.
Now, I know go on.
The one thing that's good for me, if there's anything that came out of Katrina and is coming out of this, is it produces quite a lot of emotions ranging from anger to grief to sadness to, wonder. And all of those things are good for musical creativity. So I noticed, in practicing and things, that helps me to be a little more emotional, a little more creative with my musical ideas.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the tradition that we're talking about, your tradition, Danny's tradition, seems especially well suited for processing the many emotions that we have during a moment like this and turning it into something useful, right?
Exactly. And that's why, one of the reasons I believe that traditional New Orleans jazz is not just an old music and an old set of songs or set repertoire. I believe it can be endlessly creative. I believe you can use the emotions of today and one's present life experiences to create new interpretations, new songs, still in the tradition, but also something fresh.
Now that's, of course, what you would have been doing on the stage of in Charleston. Can I prevail upon you now just to maybe play us out a little bit with something that calls up that legacy of Danny Barker that you've tapped into throughout your life?
Well, let's see. I think the thing that comes to mind immediately is one of his most popular compositions. He wrote a lot of songs, some of which he recorded with his wife, Lulu. One of his biggest songs was called Save the Bones for Henry Jones. That was recorded by Nat King Cole. But the best remembered songs of his are the things that he did with Lulu. So this is kind of like an instrumental version, a little of the melody of Don't You Feel My Leg?
Cool. Thanks a lot, Michael.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
I'm very grateful. I have a different conversation I have to have with you next week. Just about life in COVID times. Okay.
That sounds good. All right. Take care.